In the UK, what types of innovation grants are relevant for the life sciences and healthcare sectors?
So funding for the life sciences and healthcare sectors is typically focused on two main audiences, and that is private sector businesses, the business base, and also academia. But recently there's been more of an emergence and a bit of a frame shift into looking at technology transfer in terms of some collaborative projects. So really looking to marry up the private sector with the academic sector and the public sector as well. So looking specifically at businesses, the most overarching grant is the Innovate UK Smart Grant. So this is a grant that's open to all sectors. Your project can be it can be a project for anything, and it is a competitive call, so each project is assessed on its merits, and Innovate UK will fund a portfolio of projects. Now, obviously, life sciences is a very important sector in the UK, very important industry, so if you put in the right kind of project and a strong proposal, there's no reason as to why you can't be funded, whether that's the first time you apply or you can apply and be unsuccessful and then go back into the second round with a renewed proposal taking on the assessor's comments. So funding, depending on the size of your business, can be between 25 and 70%, so it's quite an attractive route of funding. More bespoke to life sciences is the biomedical catalyst. That's looking to support industry-led research into development projects looking at health and care challenges. Again, it's call-based. And each call is different, so the eligibility criteria and the specific types of projects it's looking for will change based on every call. But again, because it's geared at the life sciences sector, it is very competitive. On an academic level, the main research councils are still the main funders, so like the BB, HMRC, and also the Wellcome Trust. But as I noted earlier, there is an increasing trend at driving collaboration, and some of the funds, for example, the SBRI, are looking at really encouraging industry to solve problems that are faced by the public sector. So, for example, a recent one was looking at how to drive artificial intelligence into healthcare and into healthcare pathways. SBRIs are actually 100% funded, so they are attractive, and what they really are is pre-procurement contracts. So if you're successful in getting an SBRI, it can be a really good stepping stone to something bigger. There's also other specific ones, for example, NHSX, which is looking at bringing digital solutions into healthcare provision. And again, I think that really demonstrates how there can be tech transfer between the life sciences sector and, for example, digital and creative technologies. So, of course, on a more broad level, there is government funding from a variety of pots of money, and the devolved administrations such as Wales and such as Scotland do have their own bespoke R&D budgets, which will cover life sciences projects as well. And obviously, south of the border, there's local enterprise partnerships which will fund projects which sit within their own borders. And I think it's probably important now to point out that there's a lot more realisation that life sciences projects can be more risky inherently because of the nature of the R&D, and they do take longer to bring to market and to commercialise because obviously things like safety trials, clinical trials. So I think the more awareness that the sector begins to generate and that the funders begin to understand, then I think life sciences projects are ultimately very fundable if you have the right approach.
How do I find out about relevant grants for my company?
Well, in the United Kingdom, the life sciences and healthcare companies are able to find grants in many different types of places, actually. The United Kingdom government offers funding, and some devolved powers also offer funding as well. Trying to find them can be an issue. Quite often companies are asking advisors, universities to try and find out what are the most relevant grants. However, being EY, what we do is we work across multiple sectors up and down the country. So what we try and do is we talk to government policymakers and we understand where the grants are coming and when. This is a really important thing to do because it helps you actually anticipate where grant funding is moving towards. For a company though, when choosing which fund to use, it's important to think about exactly which projects you've got in your portfolio, which one's actually suitable for grants and which ones actually will be best for using collaborators with as well. Quite often you'll find that grant funding will ask you to collaborate, maybe up and down your supply chain. So it's important to think about how you use the grants to further your innovation, protect your intellectual property, while still being able to access funding. In terms of then thinking about the other aspects of grants, one key thing to think about is the time frame. Grants can take a bit of time to apply for, to win, and then to, of course, run a project that's grant funded. So it's important to line these things up, and only then will you actually really realise which funds are best suited to your business, to your technology, and to your business goals.
Can you tell me about how grants are best used by companies in the UK?
So the best thing I've seen from companies is when they see grants as free cash, that actually helps them to subsidise what they want to do. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if you have a grant that's 50%, then for every pound that's going out of the door, you're getting 50 pence back. So in reality, it's only 50% cost to the business. The best types of projects I've seen companies use grants for isn't for the projects which are have a very good business case, which are going to make money anyway. It's for those where the return on investment is slightly borderline, and thereby by using the grant, they can actually tip the return on investment calculation in their favour. And that's exactly really why grants are incentives. They are incentivizing businesses to do something that they wouldn't normally do. That could be to look at solutions to the pandemic. It could be to look at solutions for cancer, for diagnostics, a whole range of things. It can even be for companies to become more energy efficient with their production, as long as ultimately they are meeting the policy aims of government. And most of the time they are about keeping their citizens well, reducing emissions, or increasing productivity. I'm yet to see a grant that doesn't do one of those three things. So I think when thinking about your grants, make sure that you've got a good pipeline of ideas, that you've looked at the return on investment, cash flow analysis that you have without a grant, and then run the same calculation with a grant. And if that starts to make sense, that you, by subsidizing some of those costs, that actually you get to growth quicker, faster, or essentially improve the marketplace in a much more expedited way, then that's when I would start looking at grants.
What costs do grants cover?
Well, it's important to think about grants as actually only covering part of your business costs. Quite often, grants will cover 50 to 70% of your costs. However, let me just walk through an example so you can understand how this may work. If you've maybe got a project of £1 million, your grant may only cover £500,000. But does that mean that you actually need a full £1 million before you actually start the project up front, ready to go? No. The way grants work is you actually spend your normal day-to-day spend of resources and time and money in a way that at the end of a quarter you can then put an application back to government asking for 50% of that cost back. So for instance, if you've spent £20,000 in a month, you would then ask government for £10,000 back in order to cover 50% of those costs. So that's how it works in practice. Now, what does it actually cover specifically? Well, labour costs. It will cover the headcount and the amount of time spent on a project by your labour. Secondly, consumables, things that you're buying which you'll use within the project. Maybe as a specific piece of software, for instance, that will only be used in that project. That would be a good example of a consumable. Thirdly, capital usage. So this is where you're buying something that will probably outlive the project. You would only be able to charge a depreciation for the duration of the project on that capital. And finally, subcontracting costs. You can use grants in order to pay for some subcontracting services. Some of those can even be abroad at times, as long as it's within limits. But again, it's an opportunity for you to collaborate in a way whereby you can bring in expertise from outside. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what costs are covered by grants.
How does EY support companies in accessing and using grants?
So here at EY, we support companies of all sizes in accessing cash grants. So our services are bespoke. There's no one size fits all. It's case by case. And looking at the life cycle of grants, we help companies from end to end. So we can help scope your projects and align them with grant funds that are being announced or are in the pipeline, right through to the actual grant application and negotiation with any due diligence providers if relevant. So looking at the start of the process, a lot of companies will have maybe a hopper of projects where they want to do all 10, but they've only got funding to do 5. And we can come in and kind of take a strategic view of what projects they could look to approach funding bodies for. So we have a really innovative way of scanning the landscape to find grants that might be eligible to fund some of these projects, and we're also very well networked, and we know what funds are on the horizon, and we very much kind of engage with stakeholders to make sure that our companies are always getting information as we get it. So once a grant and a project has been identified, we will then work with a company, if they want us to essentially do the drafting of the application on their behalf. So we've got a structured methodology to gather all of the information that we require. We will then prepare a draft of the application and send it back to the company for review. And if that's maybe too much for the company, if they maybe just want a wee bit more light touch support, we can review the application. So we can take a critical assessor's eye to the application and provide feedback and comments that the company can incorporate. And then once the application is submitted, we will support the company. And if it's, sometimes going into one of the local development agencies, economic development agencies, they will contract due diligence providers to look at the technology, to comment on how innovative it is. They'll look at due diligence providers to provide feedback on the marketing strategy, on the finances. So oftentimes there'll be a lot of queries that come back to the company, and that's where we will step in and assist dealing with any of that. So, as I said, our support is very much tailored to what the company needs. And we really want to share the ethos with our companies that grants are risky, but if you get it right, there's reward there. So we want to take the burden off of companies, because obviously there's an opportunity cost to spending a lot of time applying for a grant that you might not then get. So we take that risk on board, and we really work with companies in the best way possible to secure them funding.
How about using grants to expand the size of the company?
Well, to be honest, when you're looking at using an innovation grant, you should be using it to essentially invest in an innovative product most times. This would actually help you hopefully increase your revenues, increase your profits, and be able to scale the company. So the way this would normally work, for instance, is you may have a technology which without grant funding you wouldn't be able to invest in. By using the grant funding, that then tips the balance in terms of the return on investment calculation, makes it more worthwhile actually pursuing. The grant may be able to pay for some labour cost in there, maybe some new hires potentially, but not too many, in order to actually develop the product, get it to market, increase your revenues, and of course hopefully make a profit off the back end. In terms of actually using foreign workforce in there, one thing we would say is you should always think about who is actually paying for the project. If you're going for grant funding, that funding is actually coming from the UK government. Therefore, if you are looking at hiring foreign workers and using foreign labour, for instance, then it's worth thinking about how that's perceived. The best way to look at this is to use the grant in order to bring in the expertise from outside the UK, embed that in the UK, and help grow the business in the UK and maybe export as well, so that you actually get more revenue for UK businesses. That's the way that I would use grants in order to access wider labour pools and help you grow.
What common problems do companies face with incentives?
So companies run into a lot of hurdles, or they think there's hurdles when it comes to grant funding. And I guess that's where, if you are struggling to get a bit of support and help you navigate these things, because grant funding is complex, and state aid is complex as well. So one of the major issues really is navigating the grants landscape. So there's so many grants out there, there's so many different eligibility criteria, a general lack of knowledge, I guess, as to how incentives work and what kind of projects they fund. They're called incentives because they're there to really help expedite a project that might not otherwise happen. And people oftentimes don't understand how to apply for the projects and the right language to use to demonstrate that there is a need for funding, and also how to only take eligible projects forward. So crafting a really solid proposal can be quite challenging. It's time consuming and also requires a consideration of a lot of the methodologies used to appraise the applications. So one of those examples being that obviously grant funding is public money, and in order to obtain that money, there needs to be a really good value for money justification. So often you'll hear the word counterfactual used. So you need to think about, if you didn't get the public money, what would happen to the project, and really lay all of that out for the assessor. And also, it's really key to articulate what the innovation is, what the scalability is, and how you can market that. So it's not just a case of talking about your project and getting the funding. There's a lot of boxes to tick. Often collaboration's needed for projects. Inherently, companies don't like to collaborate, especially with innovative ideas. So, how to set up consortia, how to divvy up the grant monies, how to look at the budget, who's contributing what funds, is it contribution in kind or is it cash? That can provide a bit of a rocky landscape to try and traverse as well. And then obviously there is the final, and I guess most fundamental issue is around state aid. So, is a company eligible for state aid? What are the particular directives that the fund's being offered under? And, it's a very, very complex maze. So I would say that, for any companies out there who are not sure about state aid or whether they're eligible to receive it or what the funding caps are and if they might have breached it, then I would certainly say, seek advice from a trusted advisor or seek advice from the funding body. So, there's a lot of pros to grant funding, but there's a lot of potential pitfalls as well if you don't know the landscape. So yeah, but all in, I think it's a worthwhile journey to take.
Should IP be a concern or an opportunity for a business?
Designing and implementing an IP strategy is a necessity for most successful businesses in the life sciences sector. The protection of intellectual property drives a lot of opportunity. So, for example, through enabling licensing arrangements of patents and associated know-how, gaining a technical edge on competitors, and protecting against theft and copycats. It also presents concerns in the form of having freedom to operate without infringing competitor rights, the risk of costly litigation, and decisions about how much information to disclose when seeking to register IP rights that may only have a short lifespan by the time a product actually gets to market. One of the difficulties we see businesses often face is in the long-term management of IP rights. For example, ensuring that the IP being generated by different parts of the business is being captured and securely stored, and that rational decisions are being made about how to balance a desire for broad protection in multiple countries against what can be very significant costs that scale considerably as an IP portfolio develops and matures. One area that we find many businesses are yet to fully take account of in their IP strategy is the availability of government incentives linked to innovation, in particular patent box regimes that seek to encourage and reward innovation. In short, these regimes provide tax incentives on profits derived from eligible IP rights. In the UK, this can almost halve the corporation tax rate, significantly increasing the return on investment for companies that are eligible, and also increasing the value of IP for companies that know they will be eligible once they become profitable into the future. Patent box regimes have in common a requirement for companies to meet so-called nexus conditions that look to ensure that the company trying to take advantage of the regime in the reduced tax rate has sufficient substance in that low tax jurisdiction. These in essence require the alignment of R&D activities, IP ownership and commercial activities. And the application of these rules can be quite complex. This is particularly the case, for example, with companies that carry out operations across countries or multiple corporate entities. And it's also true for companies that enter into licensing arrangements or cost-sharing arrangements with other third parties. Because of this, we recommend that companies consider patent box criteria as early as possible to prevent losing out on significant benefits years down the line. We'd be happy to discuss this further in a free consultation with any conference attendees. So, to summarize, while IP by its nature is complex, with risks and rewards across technological, operational and financial domains, the earlier that these issues are grappled with, the better the outcomes are likely to be.
What are the main changes that Brexit will bring from an immigration perspective?
The key change is that if you're a UK-based business and you're going to be hiring new talent from Europe post-Brexit, that you will need an immigration sponsor licence to be able to support visas for these employees. The sponsor licence application can be quite an involved process that takes time, so it's good to prepare now if you're planning recruitment in 2021. If you're an existing sponsor licence holder, you need to ensure you're prepared for a potentially significant increase in volume of visa applications and ensure your HR systems are ready to monitor the visa expiry tracking and working details of a much bigger population of employees than previously. First and foremost for most UK businesses is going to be the cost of access to talent in the EU. Businesses that have previously relied on the EU talent pool will now need to be prepared that they will need visa sponsorship in the future, and that the cost of hiring an EU national will go from £0 pre-Brexit up to £9,500 per worker post-Brexit. Another concern for some sectors is that traditionally lower paid roles may not be eligible for visa sponsorship. Typical examples would include agricultural, manufacturing, hospitality or care sectors. As such, businesses need to prepare now. They need to consider their workforce and talent strategies.
How will Brexit impact business travel?
There is a lot to consider regarding business travel post-Brexit to ensure that your business is compliant. A key change is that the permitted activities that EU nationals will be able to undertake in the UK after Brexit will be drastically reduced. The same also applies for UK nationals in Europe. Productive work will be strictly prohibited without a visa. This change poses a significant challenge to businesses and their compliance. Getting this wrong could have significant ramifications for the individual. We get asked questions around, what if I only go for a short trip to Europe? Will I need a visa? You may do. This is a common misconception. It's actually not the duration of your visit that determines if you need a visa, but the activities that you are doing. As such, it could be that you're overseas for just a couple of days, but the activities undertaken could require a visa. We would always recommend that companies ensure that you undertake a pre-travel assessment before travel to ensure compliance for immigration, tax and social security considerations. With regards to practical changes we will see at the border after Brexit, initially not a lot if the individual is an EU national coming into the UK. From 1 January, EU nationals will be able to use e-gates as normal and will not be required to prove that they have EU settlement status until 1st July 2021 at the earliest. However, UK nationals travelling into Europe may not be able to use e-gates. There are also changes regarding passport validity. Travellers should also remember that their European health insurance card won't be valid, and as such, comprehensive medical insurance that converts to business travel will also be required.
I've heard about the EU settlement scheme. What is this and what is the impact for my business?
The EU settlement scheme is a process of registration which all EEA and Swiss nationals and their dependent family members that were resident in the UK before 31st of December 2020 must complete in order to be able to continue living and working in the UK post-Brexit. The registration must be made before the 31st of June 2021. It's critical that your employees register before the deadline. If they fail to do so, then they may not have the right to work and then may need to apply for a work visa. Businesses are not required to do retrospective checks on existing employees to confirm if they have registered. Changes in the guidance regarding right to work checks and changes in this process for EU nationals are expected to come into force from July 2021. So businesses need to keep alert to these changes coming into effect. The good news is individuals from the EU can travel for Christmas, subject to COVID restrictions. You don't need to be physically present in the UK on the 31st of December to be able to register for the EU settlement status, but only prove that you have established your residence in the UK on or before the 31st of December. For example, your UK employment contract or lease agreement. More good news is it is easy to register under the EU settlement scheme, and applications are free of charge and can often be made using an app on your mobile phone. Typically, registration can be completed in just 15 to 20 minutes from the comfort of your own home.
We have staff currently working remotely due to COVID. Is this okay, and do we need to do anything?
From an immigration perspective, it is critical to ensure your staff have the right to work in the country that they are in at the moment. Even if the work is being delivered for the UK business that they are normally employed by, it is essential that they are not working illegally, as this could have grave consequences for both the business and the individual. The need to have a right to work depends on where the worker is physically located rather than the business that they are delivering the output for. We recommend undertaking a review as quickly as possible to establish their visa status in that country. Generally, if they are a national of a country they are currently residing in, they won't need a visa to work, but there could be significant personal and corporate tax liabilities, as well as issues such as access to social security and healthcare.
What can we do to help employees working from home to do this tax efficiently?
There is quite a lot that you can do to help, but you have to take care to structure and document things carefully. For example, you could pay a weekly allowance, which HMRC accepts as tax-free provided certain conditions are met. You could also fund things like desks and chairs for a home office, but there are restrictions. HMRC won't accept it as tax-free if, for example, there is significant private use. One area which is often overlooked is the complexity of the rules on allowable travel. Normally, travel between home and work is not tax deductible, but the waters get muddied when employees work from home a lot of the time. Having clear guidelines and policies can help.
What is IR35 and how is IR35 changing?
Up until April 2020, contractors working in the private sector will still be able to decide whether they fall inside or outside IR35. From this date on, however, the responsibility for setting IR35 status will be passed over to the client, with whichever party acts as a fee payer set to carry the liability. So typically this will be the client, or when involved, the recruitment agency. The incoming reform will apply to medium and large companies in the private sector. The rules have applied to public sector organisations since 2017. Contractors are worried that clients are inexperienced with regards to IR35 and will look to protect their liability by making inside IR35 decisions, meaning these individuals will be taxed like an employee without receiving any of the benefits that come with employment. For private sector companies to be able to continue attracting self-employed contractors, it's important they prepare for reform and ensure they're in a position to make accurate IR35 decisions. This would allow genuinely self-employed contractors to continue operating outside IR35, where they can pay themselves marginally more tax efficiently. When operating outside IR35, a contractor is responsible for their own taxes and is able to pay themselves in the most tax efficient way, usually made up of a combination of salary and dividends. If a contractor works inside IR35, they are deemed employed for tax purposes, meaning they are subject to pay as you earn, just like an employee. Up until April 2020, contractors in the private sector was calculated deemed payment of income tax that they owe HMRC for operating under IR35. From April 2020 onwards, however, contractors deemed inside IR35 will be taxed at source. The fee payer in the supply chain, either the client or the recruiter, will subtract the tax before paying the worker. This means contractors won't be required to work at the deemed payment. This has been the case in the public sector since 2017.
For assessing IR35, I have heard that businesses don't have to use the HMRC CESS tool. Is that true?
That is true. Businesses do not need to use the HMRC CESS tool. Many have used third-party advisors and other tools to help them assess the contractor's IR35 status. We invited HMRC to present earlier this week at our seminar, where they again reiterated that businesses do not have to use HMRC's tool. So, for example, we at EY have our own tool, which many businesses use. Using such a tool can really demonstrate that reasonable care has been taken, which is a key part of the new legislation from April 2021. If you have not begun to assess and identify or communicate with the affected population, we urge you to start as preparations.
What sort of pitfalls do you see employees making on national minimum wage?
Most commonly, employers can assume that they won't have any national minimum wage issues because they have headline pay rates, which are above the national minimum wage rates. Unfortunately, HMRC's approach to national minimum wage compliance is very often pedantic and technical. Things like salary sacrifice and costs which employees have to incur to work, such as clothing required, can mean the rate of pay goes below national minimum wage. HMRC then, by default, charges penalties and name and shames employers.